So, so a couple of weeks ago, Jordan Peterson was having a conversation with Ben Shapiro, and they had a very wide-ranging 2.5 hour conversation about lots of things. But what came up was Jordan started talking about something I've never heard him talk about before. I mean, he weaves in some of the stuff that he has shared in the past, but he started talking about grandparenting. This is a topic that I am particularly interested in at the moment. And what has happened to the impact that the lack of grandparenting and the presence of grandparenting has on parents. And so, anyway, I thought it was interesting. He made some comments. I want to play these for you guys. Hopefully, you'll be able to hear. I'm just going to play this from my phone. This is all going to be very lo-fi, but I think you'll be able to hear it. And so I'll kind of share a few thoughts and then get your all's thoughts. All right, here we go.
Sounds good. We see the infantilization of children and young adults and even adults themselves increasingly characterizing educational institutions say, but maybe part of that is a consequence of the breakdown of intergenerational transmission of knowledge with regards to child rearing. Because one of the things I've noticed with my kids is that like they had the model of our family for disciplinary practices, and they know those models. But I've watched, and it's often useful for them to have the example of the response of Tammy and I to the misbehavior of our grandchildren to bolster my children in their conviction that intervening to discipline them so that they're socially desirable is acceptable. So imagine this, Ben.
So his point just there, and he's going to go into more detail here, is that when you're a new parent, it's very difficult to have the confidence to correct your children in any way because what do you know? You know that you're a brand new parent, and so he's making a case. Again, I've never really heard anybody make this case before. That part of what parents need is they need the presence of the older grandparents who have that confidence. So he kind of plays this out here.
So the fundamental drive behind infant care is service to the infant, self-sacrificing service to the infant. And the rule is if the infant manifests any displays of distress, that your primary moral obligation is to alleviate that. And that's 100% true for the first 8 months, let's say. Okay, so the default feminine proclivity is the amelioration of emotional distress, immediate amelioration of emotional distress. Now, that becomes problematic when there's a conflict between short-term emotional distress and long-term thriving. And you might say that the role of wisdom is to know when to step in to allow a short-term emotional distress to be tolerated or even encouraged if the benefit is an incremented long-term adaptation.
So yeah, his point is that mothers are wired to meet the needs of their infants. And it's very difficult for that wiring to be overcome past its sort of useful point. So it's super useful when the infant's really small, but at some point you want so you have a 3-month-old who's crying is not the same as a 3-year-old who's crying. So a 3-month-old is crying. It's like, how can I, meet this need? A 3-year-old is crying. You actually have to figure out, maybe it's a good thing they're crying. Maybe they're learning something like that's a very difficult thing to traverse without having intergenerational wisdom is kind of his point.
Now, older people are wise enough to know, well, your kid wants that toy in the grocery store right now and is willing to have a fit about it. But if you give in to his tantrum and reward it, you're going to produce a child who other children can't stand because he'll play in that infantile manner whenever he's in a social circumstance. Now, you can model that with new parents and say, look, here's how you...
What he said there, I think, was really critical, and that is that so much of what's happening is you are preparing your child for socialization with other people. And when you're giving in to your child, you think, well, I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing exactly what I'm wired to do, which is just give them what they want, stop the emotional pain, alleviate the emotional pain. All the while you're training them to interact with other people in a way where their aggressiveness, their emotions, their self-centeredness is the mode that gets them the most rewards, right? Like that's the problem with not making this transition properly.
Regulate the child's emotional distress. And you can say, and you want to do that so your child's well socialized so that everyone will like him or her so they can engage in productive reciprocal interactions. But I don't think you can do that with just advice. I think you have to model it.
I mean, I totally agree with that. My wife and I are very close with my parents and also with her parents. And one of the rules in the household is that, my parents discipline my kids. When my kids are doing something wrong, I actually want them to discipline my kid. By the way, I don't actually think this is relegated to grandparents. I think that elders in the community and other parents we know who have older kids, I think it's actually quite incumbent on societies. We have this weird thing in the United States, actually, that is not usual in some other societies. In other societies, when it comes to children acting up in public, for example, it's actually pretty much expected that somebody's going to discipline the kid, whether it is the parent or not the parent. You see this in a lot of other societies, and it actually makes, I think, for better child bearing and rearing, it's considered sort of a social responsibility that if some kid is violating the rules, yeah, exactly, then there will be someone there to say the thing. In the United States, because we're very autonomous and we're very autonomy oriented, the idea is that if you say a word to my child, I'm going to be super duper angry at you and very, very upset about that. But I don't actually think that that's right. And it's certainly not true in, for example, my own religious community. If we're over at somebody's house and we're constantly interacting, obviously, with people in my immediate religious community, it's a very tight knit community. And if we're over at somebody's house and my kid does something wrong, I want somebody to discipline my kid. And in the context of generations, I mean, what you're talking about, what basically the elderly are, is they are the living tradition. Right? In fact, in the Jewish community, you're supposed to stand up for an elderly person and a Torah scholar the same way. And when they enter the room, theoretically, you're supposed to actually stand up in respect to that person. Why? Well, because my parents have already seen the outgrowth of either doing it right or doing it wrong when I was a kid, right? I only have the immediate knowledge of how old my kids are, right? I know how to raise a 9-year-old. I don't know how to raise a 16-year-old. I don't have a 16-year-old. I know how to raise my 3-year-old to be 9. I know how to raise my 7-year-old to be 9. I don't know how to raise my 9-year-old to be 16. And so, that's where my parents really are effective, because they've done it 4 times. So they know how to raise a 9-year-old to be 16 and how not to raise a 9-year-old to be 16. And so, again, the marginalization of the elderly, largely, for economic reasons, the removal of the elderly from the home, for example, which again is strange because American homes have grown. We've actually, I mean, one of the great lies of modern American economics is that people are somehow living worse now than they were in 1980, which is not true. And one of the things that we have is more living room. And one of the things
He's going to talk about, intergenerational living, but I think one of the points he made there, I mean, a couple of points. Obviously, the idea of like communities disciplining is like anathema, of course, culturally today. And I think that the better point, and I mean, I think the more critical point is that there are traditions. Judaism is really good at this, of venerating wisdom, and so there's this rising in the presence of an older person. It specifically says that in the Torah, rise in the presence of the gray-haired. It says in Psalm or Proverbs 31 that her children rise up and call her blessed, to the mother of the family, the matriarch. And so the problem is that we actually live in a society that rises in the presence of the infantile. Like, we've decided that what we actually value is innocence and naivety. And that at that stage, you're at your pinnacle of wisdom. And this is really a belief that came from a philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed that in that in our most primitive state, either in childhood or even within primitive cultures, that humanity was at its peak. And I think Rousseau actually took over the Western world in terms of its intuitions about youth and old age. And so he sees virtually anything that is coming from the years of wisdom or society as a larger entity as being corrupted. And that the only way to return to something that's not corrupt is to go back into this state of innocence. But I think what this has done is it's caused parents in our day and age to be terrified to correct their children, and to certainly not trust their parents in this way. So I'll play just a little bit more, and then I'll love to get your guys' thoughts.
that theoretically we could do is have our parents live with us more often if our parents can't afford to live on their own. And I think that would actually be of great benefit. The lack of intergenerational dialogue is truly bad. And by the way, it's working in both directions. People who are 40 aren't having kids, and also their parents aren't with them. And so they're just kind of there. And you want to talk about prolonged adolescence. Not having kids and not having parents is the definition, I think, of prolonged adolescence.
Well, the other downside of that too is that one thing you can be certain of is that you're going to get old. And so there is really no difference. There is no difference between how we treat the elderly and how we will be treated. Like, those are the same thing. And that should give everyone pause. Really, like, that should give everyone pause.
Okay, we'll pause it there. So yeah, what any thoughts you guys have about that? Sydney, why don't you start?
Well, I will forever stand on the hill that gentle parenting is not good parenting. I first encountered this when I was in Norway, and there they have a big gentle parenting culture because hitting your child in any way is illegal. So everyone there was raised with gentle parenting, and they were like, I turned out fine, so it must be okay. And the whole time I was thinking, like, you don't know what you were like when you were 3, though. like how, like, I don't know what they were like before they had these rationalities and like before they were able to think for themselves and act like adults. So, and I'm just like, I don't know how to, if you can't rationalize with a 3-year-old, you have to show them in some other way that you mean business.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's very interesting, but also they don't have a huge culture of bringing in the grandparents. And so that's like double whammy. That doesn't sound like a good recipe. So, yeah, but I do feel like what Ben was saying about I don't know how to raise a 16-year-old, but my parents do. And so for my first time raising a 16-year-old, it'll be a really good idea to bring in their wisdom and all that. That sounds just very like it seems obvious that we are wired that way, that we are created that way. That's why the grandparents um, should be venerated because they've gone through all these things that we have yet to go through.
Yeah.
And why go through things newly when you could take advantage of the wisdom of the older generation? It just seems like God has given us that advantage, and so we should um, utilize it when we can. So that makes a lot of sense. I know that for me, when I think about like getting married and moving out and having kids, I'm just like, that is so much new all at once. And I know that I'm going to be like calling my mom every day, like, Mom, how do I do this? How do I do this? Like, it's so nice to have someone that has gone through all those things that you can take advantage of. And
Yeah.
so, and the fact that they're willing to, um, you know, when grandparents reach that age, it's like the greatest joy is to invest in their children and grandchildren. So yeah, it's just like a win-win for everyone.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah, it's interesting. And I want to get Jackson and Angel, your guys' thoughts, anything that stirs up for you. One of the things that's really tough, I think, Sydney, about what's happening is that new mothers are going to the internet instead of their mothers. And sometimes that's because there is a rift between them and that generation that maybe they can't go to their mothers, but for whatever reason, they're going to the internet, they're Googling these things, they're finding extremely new and oftentimes untested parenting philosophies that are becoming like accepted and almost like virally spread because they fit oftentimes the nervous system that Peterson was describing of the mom with an infant. But like, how do you do that to a 3-year-old or 5-year-old or whatever? So it's really almost like an entire system or philosophy of parenting with tactics and everything that violates in every way the way maybe you were raised by your parents. And then
yeah.
you actually see your parents as a threat to your new parenting philosophy that you discovered yesterday on the internet. So this is a constant problem, as if we didn't need more ways of tearing the generations apart. But yeah, Jackson or Angel, or, yeah, I'm curious if you guys, this stirs up any thoughts you guys are having, or what do you guys think about this stuff?
Yeah, well, I guess I had some thoughts. I think that the biggest thing that it kind of makes me think of is it's sort of that phrase, never meet your heroes. So it's like the concept that as soon as you meet a hero that you've always looked up to, they are like some massive disappointment. And I think that a lot of people in like a search for identity have begun founding their identity in the ways that their parents have hurt them more than the ways that their parents have helped them because there's more pain than aid, I would say, these days. Um, so I don't, but if you flip that around, then suddenly your parents become your heroes a little bit, and they become the standard uh, respect. This is sort of what Ben Shapiro was talking about. And then when they become the standard of respect, and you're their kid, then it actually works both downstream and upstream. So you have a kid, you want the kid to behave. You give like the kid wants to behave and wants to behave well, not just for the parents, but for the grandparents. Especially because I remember being homeschooled, I behaved better for Grammy as my teacher than mom, just because it felt like there was a slightly, it's like it is a slightly more removed. This isn't my mother. But she gives off all the energy of my mother, but I know it's not her, so I'm a little more careful. You know, it's like that sort of a thing. It's like, yeah. So when I was being so it's sort of like there is something that a child is a little more cautious around a grandparent. Like, yeah, there's several examples of that I could use, but I would say that like the child's natural instinct would be to try to sort of look up to them, and then it works upstream as well because the parents are super embarrassed if they bring their uncontrollable child in the proximity of their parents who raised them pretty well, you know. And this is almost, and like at that point, you're almost admitting, like, yeah, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm also too proud to ask for help. As soon as you bring your like out of control 3-year-old to your, you know, your parents' house. And so, but if the grandparents are too timid to assert themselves to that level of respect, then that is what will happen. Like there's like if I'm not afraid to honor my grandparents, I'll do whatever around them, you know, and it won't matter. They'll be like one of my buds, just enabling me to do whatever I want. I've seen that in so many examples, and it's the same with parents, and they don't care how they raise their kids anymore now because the standard is gone. Yeah, and so and I understand like being, you know, of this generation, I hear what a lot of the parents and grandparents have done to young kids or whatever, and some of the pain, and I understand it and it's real. But it almost to me, it reminds me of something you told me a long time ago, Dad, about I think his name was Assad Hussein, the leader of Syria. And it was like at a moment when I was in speech and debate that year, and I was reading all these articles about the Middle East because that was the resolution this year about aid to the Middle East, foreign aid. And there was that was the year that Assad Hussein dropped chemical bombs on his own citizens. And I just couldn't stop thinking about how horrible a person he was. And then I remember you described to me what Syria was like before there was any government, and it was like 10 times worse. And it's like, and that day I kind of started looking at things that way, and I noticed that's true. Some form of government is better than no form of government, than anarchy. And I think that we're experiencing that now through what Jordan Peterson mentioned, which is how everybody gets old. So basically, and we're at the age now that those people who are raised in the philosophy that you were talking about, Dad, Jacques Rousseau, is that what you were mentioning?
Yeah.
So those babies are old now, and it's so weird. Like they're very strange old people. Like they don't demand respect. They're real hippie. They're real like relatable, and they do things and they say things that it's just like they're trying to be young again or trying to relate too hard to the young kids, and they go viral, and it's like hilarious, and everyone likes making a spectacle of that because it's more relatable. But what that really does, the minute that those grandparents start acting like that, it literally gives everybody else permission to never have to get old, like never have to mature. It's like, look, you can be 80 and life's still a joke, you know? And it's like, yeah, there's just so and I've seen a few like viral grandparents who are like, there are some that make wholesome content. There's one guy, he was like an old dude that worked at Walmart, and this black guy became friends with him, and found out that he was like a dirty minded old man who made dirty jokes and was okay with that, but was actually kind of a funny dude, like wasn't like creepy but like funny. And so he like partnered with them to make a lot of like racist joke content for like each other, and they got super viral as like a tag team. There was this white old man and this black young man, and as they're making ridicule of society and, you know, all that stuff. And yeah, it completely puts you like suddenly, because for whatever reason, and this is the last thing I'll say, is just that like you want to be like whatever old people, like I want to be like grandpa or papa. Like when I'm older, I would love to be like either of those two men. I think that would be amazing. And then as soon as this guy shows up, like that's all it takes for my brain to start being like, huh, maybe I would like to be like the young, relatable old man, you know, who's still old but doesn't act my age. I don't know. So that's sort of my 2 cents. I think that grandparents should be like are the standard, and when they falter, so does standard for behavior in general.
It's interesting, like when you were describing going to Grammy, I think that and just feeling that energy, one of the things I wonder about why children are struggling so much with ADHD and hyperactivity is that they are not around any adults with a lot of gravity.
Hmm.
And so I think sometimes what happens is the parents are through their philosophies that, oh, child, I can't ever exert any authority over my child. They are communicating to their child that you are the center. It's almost like you are the chosen one. You are the heaviest gravity of the family. You build the culture around whatever you want, and then their impulsive desires just fire up and become the thing that directs the entire family. Imagine how different that is from living in a multi-generational family where all of a sudden you're in the presence of your grandfather or your grandmother and you're like you sense the gravity of like everyone's respecting them and we all are very careful to understand that they have wisdom and I think that a lot of times when you're raised in an environment like that of where you're not the center of gravity, where you get to orbit other people who have lived longer and have more wisdom, that it actually calms the spirit and it causes children. I remember being in the presence of when I would go to Michigan and just be with, all of my great aunts and great uncles. It was just like something was always happening to me, almost physically, right? I could feel the gravity of being in their presence and just like these people are older, they have way more wisdom, and they actually like me, like it was such a cool experience to be close to somebody who's definitely wielding that wisdom, and then as a child to just submit under it and understand. Of course, that makes sense, but I think most children today, literally, they don't ever have that experience of being in the presence of someone where they're being it's where everyone is insisting that you orbit this person, not because they're more important than you metaphysically. It's because of their wisdom. Like we are honoring wisdom as opposed to an obsession or overvaluing like innocence or naivety or youth or something like that. So
I think that's another reason, another problem I have with the gentle parenting thing is because if the child does something wrong, then you have to completely stop whatever you're doing and like be willing to have a long conversation with them about why that thing was wrong and all that stuff. Like it makes them the center of like your day and the things that you do, your activities are completely dictated by them and their behavior. And that is the gravity. Like I think that's what you were talking about. Whereas like if they realized that you were the one that was in charge and that you were the one deciding what to do and all that stuff and if the grandparents are coming over, we're gonna like spend time with them. We're going to make sure to do what they want to do and like all that stuff. Like if they were to acknowledge that, then it would look a lot different.